strikeouts in a game. 20.
Swung on and driven to deep left. And a high. No score. Yankees win. Yankees win. Bernie Williams homers deep in the left field seat to lead off the 11th inning on a 1-run finish. And the Yankees beat the Orioles 5-4 to win Game 1 of the American League Championship Series. Burn, baby, burn. He's done it again.
Deep left. There it goes. Turning into history. He's done it. He has done it. 62. Aaron Judge is the American League single-season home run leader. The AL King. Case closed.
What is going on, baseball fans? Jeremy Latacuente here for the Baseball Banter Broadcast. Once again, bringing you our series coverage here, previewing every team in Major League Baseball with the state of the franchise. From championship glory to rebuilding years, every team has a story. And today, the story that we are discussing is that of the Toronto Blue Jays. But before we get into it, if you are following us here on the YouTube side of things, make sure you leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell for post notifications, as it does help us continue to grow this community. And you'll be notified each and every time we drop new content like the state of the franchise. If you're also checking us out, make sure you check out our link tree, as it does have all the pertinence to our merch store, sponsor links, as well as our social platforms and the audio side. If you're listening on the audio side, make sure you leave a 5-star rating and review. And to help me discuss today the Toronto Blue Jays, I am bringing on a guest from Blue Jays Nation. What's going on, Tyson?
Nothing much. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So as we go through this series and we look at each team individually, we like to get a little bit of a retrospective and kind of a gut reaction as to how the previous campaign went. So what is your gut feelings on the 2024 season for the Blue Jays?
The 2024 season was a huge disappointment for this franchise. You had a couple players down with injury, Bo Bichette being the biggest, but overall the expectation has been kind of sky high for this team that hasn't, went through the rebuilding years in the late 2010s to, coming into the 2020s and looking to find playoff glory in the form of at least a win, and they haven't done that yet, right? So heading into 2024, the expectation was there that would happen, and it didn't happen in the slightest. And the offseason leading into that was, filled with disappointment too, because of the whole Shohei Ohtani saga that followed, right? So at the end of the day, it was a pretty big disappointment. They ended up selling a lot of assets at the deadline, those expiring deals and veteran contracts, and kind of threw in the towel, put some prospects in to see how they would do, and turn towards 2025. So it was a pretty big disappointment overall, 2024 wise.
Yeah, definitely. This club has had a lot of expectations, as you said, over the last several years in terms of looking as a team that was a heavy favorite in the American League Beast, as I like to call it. With the teams that we have in this division, all 5 realistically could be competitive on a year in and year out basis, it feels like. And to see the Blue Jays kind of go through what they've gone through the last few years, where they have, like you said, been kind of a disappointment for fans. I feel like that's kind of the overwhelming tone that has been set. It's going to be interesting to see how this year plays out. Now, you mentioned last year the whole Shohei Ohtani debacle, and going into this season, it kind of felt like it was going to be more of the same. But then you guys ended up being able to make some moves. You picked up, Jeff Hoffman, Anthony Santander, obviously, is the big offensive name that got added. Max Scherzer, the trade for Andres Jimenez. Of the moves that the Blue Jays made in their acquisitions this offseason, what's kind of the one that stands out as the most important to you and kind of the most underrated?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a tie, and I think it's between the addition of Santander and the addition of Scherzer, because Santander addresses a pretty big hole for the Blue Jays. And last season, that was their power, right? They didn't really have anyone to kind of complement beside Guerrero Jr. And for a team that just was looking to produce runs in the American League East and just overall in the American League, right? Like you needed to have those type of players. And again, with Bichette being hurt, he's a guy that usually you lean on. George Springer didn't have a strong campaign. They were really missing kind of a complementary piece to join Guerrero Jr. on the power side, and they didn't have that. And Santander kind of bridges that gap, right? Past 3 seasons, he's had 30 plus home runs coming off a 40 home run season, hits from both sides of the plate. That's the kind of guy that the Blue Jays needed to have in their lineup. The 5-year deal is a little bit heavy, but to get a player like him, I think the Blue Jays felt comfortable doing that, especially since they think the power can play, especially somewhere like the Rogers Center. And again, Santer's from the American League East, right? So he knows the different ballparks. He knows Fenway, he knows Yankees, he knows, Tropicana Field in theory when they're normally playing there. So that's a good signing there. It addresses kind of a need that the Blue Jays had, right? And in comparison to last winter, they didn't really address those needs, right? So that was a big check mark there. And then adding Scherzer, I think, really cemented that the Blue Jays are kind of going for it this year, right? Like he's at the part of his career where he's not in it to make, hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Like he's just trying to win again. Yep. And it's a bit of a vote of confidence to think that he knows, I shouldn't say knows, but he expects the Blue Jays to be in that conversation, and he expects to be a piece that can kind of contribute. And the Blue Jays going in kind of needed another arm to supplement it within the rotation, right? And Scherzer has his qualms, right? He's had the back injury that's kind of kept him out a little bit, so he's getting up in the twilight of his career in the later years, right? But still has some stuff left in the tank, so it's a bit of a risky move, but it also, I think, plays on both sides. Of the Blue Jays needed a starter that's competent, that has the aspect to get 140 plus innings, and when Scherzer's healthy, he can do that. And then at the same time, it's a vote of confidence to show that Scherzer believes that the Blue Jays team can compete and also, contend for a postseason spot come October.
No, for sure. Yeah, I agree with all your points on that. Scherzer was interesting to me, in the second reason that you said more than anything else, because obviously we know he's super intense, a super competitor. So he's going to go out there and he's going to end things on his own terms. I mean, he made the gamble with himself when Detroit tried to give him the extension and went out and won that bet and that gamble on himself. So for him to come out again this year looking to be a reliable starter isn't, to me, something that is completely out of the realm of possibility. But for him to look at the Blue Jays as a team that is a viable contender, as the place that he is going to latch onto for this year to try to go out and win, that to me is a big sign. The other move that you guys made that I really am curious and intrigued to hear your thoughts on is the Andres Gimenez trade. Obviously, this is a platinum level, glove, a guy who, when hitting well, can be a very solid bat in the lower half of the lineup. But we've seen him kind of decline a little bit over the last few years. And my question to you about Gimenez is he a guy that is basically insurance for if Bo Bichette leaves via free agency next year?
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely something to kind of contend with, because Bichette, for many of us Blue Jays fans, writers, etc., it kind of seems like he's on the way out. Mostly just from the conversations. They haven't really had extension talks with him as of late. And he's definitely that insurance, because his natural position can be shortstop. But I think what's also intriguing too is the Blue Jays, outside of over the next few seasons, they lose a lot of the roster core when it comes to contract stability. And Gimenez is on the books for the next, I think it was 4 or 5 years, right? And so although his valuation, it hits a little higher on the $20 million side, it provides a little bit of contract stability when you look at the bigger picture, in the sense that, yeah, if Bichette does leave, then you got a guy that can play shortstop at an elite level defense. But I think what also is interesting as well is that the Blue Jays kind of brought in some new hitting staff, right? Like they lost I can't remember the name off the top of my head. He went to Pittsburgh. They brought in David Hopkins from Minnesota, right? Like, and it's kind of going in contrast with what Dan Mattingly was doing with the Blue Jays before, right? So I think bringing in Gimenez, bringing in some new faces in the coaching staff, I think they're trying to find that 2022 form, right, from Gimenez when he was in that MVP conversation. And the Blue Jays of late, in the past few off seasons, have been really focused on defense, right? Like one of the reasons they traded Gabriel Moreno for Dalton Varsho, and just using some of that defensive talent to kind of supplement some of the areas that, they have a little bit of offensive side, but they're really glove focused, right? And I think he fits into that picture in a couple sense. And then they're kind of also hoping that the bat finds a level that hasn't been seen before, right? And I think they were comfortable with trading Spencer Horwitz away. Depending on, again, they had a first baseman in Guerrero. Horowitz likely wasn't going to get a lot of playing time. He's battling some injuries right now too, right? And I think also what the Blue Jays got too, right? Like they got Nick Sandlin, a reliever who has a lot of funky mechanics that almost operates as like an opposite splits kind of guy. So they didn't have they have a lefty in Brendan Little. They don't have a ton of depth behind them other than some guys in a minor league contract. So I think benefit was having both of those guys come in. But Jimenez is kind of got a couple boxes to tick when it comes to his defense, the covering of the bow side, and just potentially finding that offensive form that we've seen before, but not as of late.
For sure. Yeah, I always think back when it comes to the Blue Jays and kind of revamping a swing to find offense and hidden talent in Jose Bautista. He's back in MLB The Show, MLB The Show 2025, and we've seen the trailer of the bat flip. Of all bat flips, to me, it's the one that started the generation of bat flipping.
Right.
So it's going to be interesting to see if the Blue Jays can find something in Jimenez's swing and kind of unlock more offensive potential. I don't think he's going to hit 54 home runs like Bautista did, but
that'd be great.
A little bit more. Yeah, for sure. It would be very interesting to see if he can put up 54. But, I think that there could be more in that swing for sure. So it's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out. Now, you've mentioned a couple of guys already that, are injury concerns right now. Darton Varsho is playing in spring games, but he's working his way back from the rotator cuff. Scherzer is down right now with a little bit of a sore thumb. Eric Swanson's out. And you have a couple of guys that are working their way back from UCL injuries in Ricky Tiedemann and Alek Manoah. Of the guys that are injured, which is kind of the one that you're most concerned about for the season?
Yeah, I think losing Eric Swanson is going to be a bit of a hit to the bullpen. He had a really rough season last year. There were some things, off the field, on the field that he just was really struggling with. But to not have him, he's a guy that the Jays really depended on in the back end of the bullpen, with his strikeout rates, his splitter doing what it can do. And I think, he's meeting with Dr. Meister tomorrow in Texas. And usually when that happens, it's Tommy John right after. So I think a lot of fans are expecting him to be down for the considerable future. And for the Blue Jays, their bullpen was such a weak point last year. To lose him after all the moves and everything they make, right? With Hoffman, Sandlin, Chad Green being there, losing someone like Swanson, who many expected to hopefully return to his 2023 form, that's a big deal, right? And the Blue Jays, for what it's worth, don't have a ton of veteran high level guys to really depend on in the minor leagues from a bullpen standpoint. They got a couple prospects that are intriguing to those who follow the prospect system, but it's definitely a concern, right? And on top of that, you have Scherzer, who has the injury history but hasn't shown it, right? The thumb thing's really nothing too considerable at this. He's just sore, right? It's spring, he's ramping up, right? And I think what a lot of fans are hoping is Alek Manoah does what Hyun-Jin Ryu did a few years back, right? Where he kind of came in the second half of the season and really provided that spark for the Jays down the stretch when they were trying to, play postseason baseball. So I think right now it's definitely Swanson, just because that bullpen is such a question mark after how last season fared, that you were really hoping for him to be on the back end with Garcia, Chad Green, and Hoffman. That losing him isn't the worst thing in the world, but it's definitely something that doesn't benefit the squad just because of the recent expectations.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, it's one of these things, and we see so many injuries, especially in the early part of the season, to pitchers. Obviously, we know the spring training is as long as it is because of pitchers getting their work in and ramping up, especially for the starters. But, the way the game has gone, having that quality bullpen is such a big deal. And to lose an arm like that, like you said, one of those reliable back end types is potentially a big blow. So we'll see how that all shakes out for the Blue Jays. Now, one of the interesting sections that we go through on this series, and it's one of my favorites, is looking at the X factor. So, tell me for you, who is the X factor for the Blue Jays, and what does that success look like?
Yeah, so the easy one is Guerrero Jr., right? Because he's just such an offensive stalwart. But the one that I'm going to put out there, I think, is really important is Alejandro Kirk. Because entering this season, he's the go-to guy, right? Like for since 2019, right? Like Danny Jansen's been in the fold, right? Like when the core came up, Jansen was the first, right? Like he was up there, right? And then Guerrero, Bichette, and Biggio, and all of them, they all followed, right? Like, but and over the past few seasons, you had Kirk and Jansen, right? You always had that tandem. And Jansen had a bit of a streaky health history. Kirk's been on the IL a few times, but you always at least had one of them around that made you feel a little bit comfortable. And now you don't, right? Like you just have Alejandro Kirk. And if Alejandro Kirk goes down, like the Blue Jays are screwed, right? Like in terms of catching depth, right? They have Christian Bethancourt in on a minor league deal. They have Tyler Heineman in there. They have Ali Sanchez. Like these are guys that you don't normally expect to get like 90 plus games out of them. And if the Blue Jays have to turn to that, like it's the season's gone downhill in a hurry, right? So I think Alejandro Kirk is definitely the X factor. He's the guy that you're going to heavily lean on this season to be the main back catcher for the Jays. It's going to be uncharted territory for him because he's not going to have that tandem aspect to kind of work with. And there's potential that he might start to fade as the season goes on, right? Because he's getting that experience. He's going into areas that he hasn't gone into before in terms from a catching perspective without having to be in the DH spot, right? So I think for him, he's been so defensive, steady as of late. To have his bat come back like we saw a few seasons ago would be a huge bonus to this Blue Jays team again, just because their power was so lacking this past season and even the season before. Having him be the defensive stalwart that we've seen from him recently, having his bat come back, and then having him be healthy throughout the season is a huge X factor for this Blue Jays and their success for the season.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I think something that's kind of overlooked is the fact that the Jays have had that tandem, consistently throughout the course of the last, 4 or 5 years. And when you look at the fact that now that's going to be gone, it was almost like a cushion. Like you said, you always had one of those guys up and running. And, Danny Jansen has always been a bugaboo for the Yankees. So it's the guy that he plays, like the worst hitter in baseball against everybody else, but he always managed to show up against the Yankees. So I'm not sad.
Couple good games.
So it's not much easier for us, but no, I think that's an interesting pick. For me, I look at it and it kind of seems like an obvious name, but Bo Bichette. I think that as much as Guerrero gets all the hype in the lineup, and rightfully so, the man is an amazing hitter. You know what he's going to do. If he's healthy, you know what he's going to do. He's going to be a consistent part of that order. He's going to be the most feared bat in that lineup. But I think that for the Blue Jays' success, when they were kind of playing at their best, Bo was also an offensive force. And I think that, what we've seen a little bit in terms of from the outside looking in terms of the spring training and lineups and stuff like that. And I know it's spring training, you can't really give it too much credence, but he's been hitting the leadoff a lot. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how they kind of pivot away from George Springer in that role. And if they do have Bichette leading off and seeing how he does in that role, kind of getting the team started. And that to me is the guy that I peg as the X factor for the Blue Jays to have a successful season. If Bo bounces back and is the offensive force we've seen him be before, I think the Blue Jays are going to be in a good position.
Yeah, 100%. I think if there was an award for, going in being like, you need to figure, you need to return to form really badly, he'd definitely be the leading candidate. And I think what's interesting, and you touched on it, right, is the leadoff position, right? Because George Springer has been that guy, right? Like even when he was with the Astros, like just leading off, being that guy, the go-to force. And this past season, even the season before, like we've really seen a decline with his bat. And spring training stats you mentioned it, just you take him with a bit of a grain of salt, right? But he's struggling this spring too, right? So I think at the end of the day, the Blue Jays need to put the best team on the field. they're not going to like get rid of Springer, I don't think, anytime soon, just because he's worth so much money on paper, right? Like you can't cut him too quickly. You don't want to do a Troy Tulowitzki like 2.0, if you will. And I think at the end of the day, it's Bo Bichette at the top of the lineup, and if he can find that form again, that makes him such, the guy that led the league in hits for a couple seasons a few years ago, right? Like that's going to be such a huge key factor for this team as well. And I think up there in terms of offensive output. Like I said, one of the key things last year was Guerrero Jr. didn't have a batting partner to kind of go with him. And part of that was because Bichette was battling injuries so much and he was struggling when he was on the field, whether or not that was tied to his injuries and he was like battling through it or whatever, right? But I think it just adds to the whole narrative of the Blue Jays when it comes to this season is a pretty big season for them. And Bo Bichette's at the top of the list of players that is going to be a driving force on this team.
Now, when we look towards, the future of this organization, obviously looking at the top prospects in terms of the Blue Jays and their franchise, what can you tell us about the Blue Jays top prospect and if there's any other prospects that you're interested in?
Yeah, so the Blue Jays farm system is in an interesting spot. It doesn't gain a lot of attention when it comes to like the top prospect list, like they're in the back end there, but they have a lot of interesting names when it comes to players that can really kind of find themselves at the major league level, right? And I think overall the top prospect is Arjun Namala, right? The shortstop who's 2 to 3 years away from the big leagues, but he's such an interesting prospect because he bats not like a shortstop, right? But he's got the mentality and the athleticism to hang at shortstop, right? Like he can drive the ball just a mile long, right? His swing is pretty steady. And last season the Blue Jays challenged him with the move to single A Dunedin, right? And he was on the lower end of the age group there. And he struggled at times, right? Like he wasn't having a good time there. And they brought him back and they said, okay, let's revamp it. Let's go back to the drawing board. And once they did, he came back and he was hitting with a vengeance, right? And I think that he's and MLB Pipeline has him at number one, and I think that's the right spot for him, just because he's so projected. He's projected to stay at shortstop. He's projected to be that type of driving force that can hit the ball a long way, put the ball in play, steal a base when you need, right? Just kind of an all-around player, and he's gaining a lot of praise from others, right? Like Francisco Lindor, I think, was talking really highly about him at times too, and there's a reason, right? And he's definitely that big driving force. But I think if you're keeping tabs on other prospects, the one that's going to be the biggest impact in 2025 is going to be Alan Rodin, outfielder, and the Blue Jays haven't had an outfielder kind of break into the big leagues in quite some time, right? Like the last one that kind of did that was Dalton Pompey, and he fizzled out kind of quickly. Part of it being he was Canadian, right? Like, so, there's always the mentality around Canadians playing for the Blue Jays, but he was going to be the next guy, right? And that didn't happen. And then the Blue Jays kind of pivoted to adding resources in from the outside, right? Like Randall Grichuk and George Springer, right? Like, and all these other guys that play in the outfield. But Rodin is such an interesting prospect because he's not a typical power hitter, right? Like, I think he's only been with the Blue Jays. I think he got drafted in like 2022, but he just puts the ball in place so often. And last season he did find some power, right? Like I think he hit like 16 home runs or something like that. And that was really impressive. And he got bumped up to AAA and at the end of the season, and he just continued to put the ball in play. And one of the big things this spring was he was playing in the outfield against the Red Sox. He made a diving catch and had like a double on the day. Like this guy is just having an outstanding spring. And the Blue Jays have a lot of players that, you could argue are going to be in the big leagues, but you could also be like, oh, we don't have roster spots. You're going to start in AAA. Like, Joey Loperfido, Jonathan Clase, Stuart Burrow, Addison Barger, like all these different guys, like they could be in the big leagues, but there's not enough bench spots, right, to go around. Plus, you have Santander, George Springer, right? And Alan Rodin is the one player that you're seeing the spring going, yeah, he's only played a handful of games in AAA, but like, how do we not bring his bat north of the border, right? And there's so many different things going on, but I think with Rodin, I think you're going to see him start the year in AAA, and I think what's going to happen is by the end of April, he's going to be hitting so well that the Blue Jays are just going to have to find a way to bring his bat up, whether it's the DH spot, whether it's in left field and Santander's a DH or George Springer's a DH or something, like he's going to force this Blue Jays team to make decisions that are tough. And that's kind of what you want from a prospect. And he's just been lights out so far this spring. And I think a lot of Blue Jays fans are pretty excited just to have an outfield prospect be banging on that MLB door so hard.
Yeah, no, it's going to be interesting to see because, as you mentioned, they do have a lot of players that are not going to have a lot of spots to play on. So it's going to be interesting to see how the rosters shake out. This time of year for me is always extremely interesting just because of that fact. We see so many guys that get picked up, on the final days of spring training and get picked up by different teams and trades made, because of that roster crunch. So definitely going to be intriguing to see kind of how the Blue Jays decide to shake everything out for the 2025 campaign. Now, one of the other sections in this series that we like that is one of my favorites is the bold prediction, right? So what do you have as a bold prediction for the Blue Jays?
I think my bold prediction is that the Blue Jays finish second in the AL East and they find a way to secure a wild card spot and win a playoff game for the first time since 2016. I think this Blue Jays team has a lot of things going for them when they're able to execute their game plan. And we both know the AL East is so competitive, right? Like the Rays just always figure out a way to win on unlimited payroll and finding a guy that just works well. And the Red Sox on many facets got pretty bad, like pretty good this offseason. Yeah. The Yankees are dealing with some injuries, so who knows what's going to happen there. And the Orioles just have such a young, strong core that, again, they're a bit of a toss-up. But we saw last season what they can do until the playoffs hit, right? So I think this season's going to be a dogfight. I think the Blue Jays are going to have a strong start to the year, and that strong start to the year is just going to continue on. And I don't think they win the AL East. I think they kind of flirt with it a little bit. They make some pickups at the trade deadline like they normally do when they're competitive. And then I think they finish second and find a way to at least win one wild card game, just so that way the fans don't burn the Rogers Center down.
Yeah, so mine's kind of on the opposite side of things. It's so my bold prediction is that both Vlad and Bo Bichette get moved at the deadline. I think that, yeah. So obviously, you got to get bold with these takes, and obviously it's going to sound like a Yankee fan throwing shade, but at the same point, I think that what we've seen from the Blue Jays the last few years, as we've discussed already, has kind of been a little bit disappointing, right? And I think if they get off to a slow start, they're going to move both of them to get whatever they can back for them, thinking that neither one is likely to return. So I think that that's going to be my bold take on that.
See, if I had to throw a second bold take out there, I think it's the Blue Jays sign Guerrero Jr. before spring training's done.
Yeah,
after the recent leak with the financials.
Yeah,
I think they both. I know Vlad said he's not going to talk about it or whatever, but if a check shows up and says, "Yeah, we know 450 wasn't going to do it, and you wanted 5 or whatever, but how's 480?" I think the door opens, right? Like, so that's my other bold prediction. If I'm going to throw a second one out there.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard that before from players that, oh yeah, I'm not going to talk about it, and then before the spring training gets up, there's a deal done. So
they're signed, right?
Exactly, and I think that for Vlad, some of his comments lead me to believe that he is interested in a return to the Blue Jays. Interested to be kind of that legacy, that career guy with the one team. So it is going to be interesting to me to see how it all shakes out. I think if you get beyond the end of spring training, though, I think he's gone.
Yeah, free agency. Yeah, it's got to be before spring training ends. I agree, because once spring training ends and the year starts, it's like, okay, now if you have a great year, you can get a few more millions, right? Which we've seen from him, on at least his side, being like, I have a number in mind, right? So I agree there. Yeah.
Yeah. But so I think both good, bold predictions from you. Obviously, mine sound a little more heinous when it comes to Blue Jays fans, but yeah, got to get bold with these takes. So now
Right.
the question that I have for you is, what's the biggest question facing the organization in 2025?
Overall, it's just whether or not you can turn a roster that was told to be developed and on paper is supposed to be a good team and turn it into playoff success, right? Like this, how after last season went, so many fans were banging on the door for Ross Atkins, general manager, to get fired, right? And that didn't happen. And this season, he's entering the season on a hot seat, right? Like he's not guaranteed to make it through this season. And if the Blue Jays come out and put up just an absolute brutal start to the year, like definitely like things will change, right? Whether that's a rebuild, whether that's he gets axed and they put James Click in there, who's on the front office staff, right? Like who knows what's going to happen there? But I think for the Blue Jays, the biggest thing for them, the biggest question mark is whether or not they can turn a team on paper who should be doing well into actual success, right? And actual success for Blue Jays fans, because they're crazy, is World Series every year. Like that's the expectation, right? You see it with people who cheer for the Toronto Maple Leafs, right? Like it's Stanley Cup or nothing, right? And they've been disappointed for decades. So I think with the Blue Jays, you get a lot of the same fans, right? Where it's the expectation is to win. You expect to win every year. And I think what adds into that fuel to the fire is that after the rebuild, this front office said, oh, we're going to have a great farm system and we're going to be winning, right? Like we're going to be win games. Well, the farm system isn't amazing and you haven't won a playoff game like with your own team. Like even in 2016, like that was what Alex Anthopoulos like left you, right? Like those were veteran guys on the way out. So the fans have gone through a rebuild. They haven't seen the success of a team winning in the postseason under this new management. So I think at the end of the day, like this team just has to win. And the biggest question is whether or not they can execute that, whether or not they, the offseason additions they did this year are going to do that, whether the rotation is going to hold up. And that's a bigger picture thing, right? Like the power aspect, whether they're going to do that. And at the end of the day, the front office has assembled a team that in theory should be contending for at least a wild card, right? Like even in the AL East, like this team is projected to win, I think it was depends how you look at it, but between 85 to 90 games, right? And that's sometimes good enough to win a wild card. That's sometimes not good enough to win a wild card, depending on how the AL shakes out. And at the end of the day, this front office knows they're on the hot seat. They're not going to be around to do a rebuild. Like Atkins will not be around to do a rebuild, or shouldn't be at least, right? Like that's doing an injustice to the Blue Jays if the front office is given a second chance to do a rebuild, right? So they know they're on the hot seat. They know they have to win. They know they have some moves to make to make this team better. And they know that this season's pretty much a make or break, especially since you have core players like Bichette and Guerrero and Kevin Gausman and Chris Bassett and Jose Barros who can opt out of his deal. Like these guys are all free agent eligible in the next few years, like next 2 years even, right? Like, so it's pretty much, go hard, win now. And if you are going to rebuild, then the heads are going to roll and there's going to be a lot of change coming to this Blue Jays organization.
For sure. So that kind of segues perfectly into my next question. And is then the biggest frustration for the fan base the lack of, kind of play on the field from the players and the way that they've been unsuccessful, or is it the way that the front office has dealt with things?
The biggest frustration right now for Jays fans is Guerrero, 100%, right? And I think again, part of it stems from not being on the trend of extending hometown stars, right? Like you saw the Mariners, they did that with Rodriguez, right? Like the Yankees brought back Judge, like Tatis, sorry, in San Diego, right? Like there's these young guys being extended to huge contracts that are keeping them in the places that they've been for a long period of time, right? Or at least in those organizations for a long period of time. And the Blue Jays just haven't hopped on that trend. The only one that they've done is Jose Barrios, and they traded for him, right? And it was huge that they did that, right? Like they convinced him not to go to free agency in the following year, kind of like what Guerrero was doing this winter, sorry. And they just haven't hopped on that trend. And I think the expectation was this winter that out of everything, the offseason the offseason success was contingent on whether or not you extended him, and that didn't happen, right? And it's an interesting concept because if you look back over the years, like in 2022, Guerrero was not a $500 million player, right? Like he wasn't a huge base threat. He wasn't hitting well. He was just hitting around 800. Like he was hitting okay. Like he was still 270 average, but he wasn't the driving force of the Jays, right? Like in 2021, you saw the MVP type guy where he just lost to Ohtani because Ohtani's a supernatural freak on both sides, right? Like, and then you saw in 2023 he wasn't that guy again, and then in 2024 he had an amazing second half of the season, right? So I can see why the Jays didn't extend him in 2021 or 2022 because there was, or 2022, 22, and 3 because that's not a $500 million player, right? But then this offseason, he proved that he can be that guy, right? And for a Jays franchise that doesn't have a lot of contract stability heading out of this season, he's the face of the franchise. He said he wants to be here. And, 500, I think it was 500 million he wants, which is a crazy amount for a slugging first baseman. But that's the cost of doing business, right? Like Willie Adames and the Giants got like what was it, like 25+ million or whatever. Like it's that's how it is, right? Like that's the name of the game today. And the Blue Jays, for what it's worth, I think for an extra $3 million a season, couldn't find a way to make a deal work. And considering they're owned by one of the largest multimedia companies in Canada, it's like, well, make it work, right? Like I get it, but make it work, right? And that didn't happen. So the Jays franchise, the fan base is at least they're just frustrated because that key player, that guy that you look to, is not signed to a long-term deal. There's no stability in 2 years' time for this roster, and he's the driving force. He's the guy. He's the one that you want in the bottom of the ninth to step to the plate with the game on the line. And he could walk at the end of the year for compensation, right? Which brings your bold prediction back into play. Do they trade him, right? Which is going to drive so much conversation this year. It's an additional distraction, right? Every city he visits, he's going to get asked the questions about free agency, and it's just another level of distraction. That again, that's why I think many are hoping that he gets signed to an extension before the end of spring training, because it's just going to be such a rolling ball narrative throughout the year that's just going to be driving the fan base nuts.
For sure. And in seeing Judge doing his walk here and the way that was playing out, it becomes a distraction not only to the player, but also to his teammates and in that clubhouse, because then 100%. The reporters are going to go ask his teammates, how do you feel about Guerrero's potential walking? And that becomes the story and more of a nuisance than anything else to a team that, like you said, has these expectations and has had these expectations to try and go out there and win. So, yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how that all shakes out. Now, in looking at Guerrero, how would you grade out the offense for the Blue Jays as a whole?
I think the offense, I think the offense right now is sitting at, like, if I had to get it like a letter grade, like a high B, like a B+. And I think it's a solid rating because you have a lot of the pieces that are there, right? But you have Guerrero, who you expect to hit 30+ home runs and be a driving force. You have Anthony Santander, who you expect to hit 30+ home runs and again be the guy that is up there in RBIs. But then you have a lot of question marks surrounding this team, and it would have been great to see the Blue Jays get another bat, right? Like another DH type, if you will, that can kind of switch with Santander a little bit. And that kind of didn't happen. But at the same time, the Blue Jays have some internal question marks that could kind of bring up the slag, if you will, when it comes to filling in those. So like Orelvis Martinez, right? Like he missed a big chunk of last year because of his PED suspension, but he's a guy that from 2022 and 2023, like led the minor league, the Blue Jays system in home runs with 20+ each year. Like he's a guy that can hit the ball a long way, PED suspension aside. We've seen him hit the long way when he's clean. So I think they're expecting like him to be a big part. They're expecting the likes of Davis Schneider, who has some really sneaky power, to be a big part. Joey Loperfido can hit the ball a long way too in the minor leagues. And we haven't seen that in the big leagues yet. But again, these type of guys, I think they're expecting kind of pick up the slack. And Bo Bichette even, right? Like we don't know the Bo we're going to get this year after having such a lackluster 2024 campaign where he was hurt. And even when he was healthy, he wasn't swinging well. So I think B+ is where the offense sits right now. I think there's some question marks that kind of bring that grade down. But if everyone does exactly what they're supposed to do, which never happens, easily it goes into the A category. But there's too many question marks to make that into that area yet, just because so many things can go awry so quickly out of the gate.
Yeah, for sure. We're kind of in lockstep there. I had it as a B, and I think it's because of those questions that you said. I also think about, a question that we spoke about earlier with Alejandro Kirk and how he's going to be now taking on the majority of the games. It's not going to be more of that even split that he's had the last few years with Danny Jansen, and how does that workload play out on his offense? I agree. I think that it is going to be a team that if everything is pushing on the right cylinders, everything's hitting on the right accord, that they're going to be an offensive force. But to me, there are some questions about what the team is going to be able to do as a whole. So I think a B is a solid grade. So I believe we're kind of in the same place there. Now, when it comes to the pitching side of things, how would you grade out the pitching staff?
I'd put them in the same category. I think when this rotation, especially since the addition of Scherzer, like the top four there are pretty strong, right? Like Kevin Gausman, Barrios, Bassett, Scherzer. Like when these guys are pitching, like we know they can, like they're a pretty deadly rotation, right? Like Kevin Gausman was in the Cy Young conversation a couple of years back there. Like Barrios was having he had a really strong start to the 2024 season. He kind of fizzled as the season went on, but he still put up pretty good numbers. Bassett didn't have a great 2024 season, but his 2023 was pretty good. And Scherzer, we know what Scherzer can do when he's healthy, right? And I think having a starting four like that, even though they're a little higher in age, so there is that risk that's involved when they're pitching like we know that they can. They're going to give the Jays 5+ innings a day, limited runs when everything's going well. And then you have a bit of a toss up in the fifth, right? Like that fifth spot, like you have Bowden Francis, who had such a hot end to the year, who's struggling this spring, right? Like you don't know if he's going to be the guy. You have Ariel Rodriguez, who could be into that mix too, but he's also not having a hot spring either, right? And the spring training stats only goes so far when it goes into the regular season, but that fifth spot leaves a little bit of a question mark up in the air. And I think for the Blue Jays, at least the confidence that it has for those four is good. And you can kind of tinker around with that fifth one a little bit based on who they have. They had Jake Bloss sitting around too. He could potentially come in and be a guy, right? Like you just don't know. But at least the history is on the Blue Jays side when it comes to that rotation. And then the bullpen, it's so tough again because the 2022 season 2023, they were up there, like they were top 5 in so many categories. They were so great. And heading into 2024, the only person they lost was Jordan Hicks, right? And he was only there from the trade deadline on, but they lost him. And then in 2024, they were awful, right? Like Tim Meza couldn't find his form. He ended up joining the Yankees. Jordan Romano was gone for a huge part of the season. A bunch of guys hit the IL too, and used 20+ different relievers to just make it through the end of the season, especially after they sold off some of those contracts. And I think they did a lot of really good work to revamp this bullpen, right? And Romano's not around anymore. That one stings again from the Canadian perspective of having Canadians playing on the Blue Jays, right? And just from what we've seen, but getting Jeff Hoffman, who's just really found a groove in the bullpen, having Chad Green back there be a setup guy, Swanson when he was healthy was a good thing too, and bringing back Jimmy Garcia, who's had a lot of success in Toronto, and bringing in Sandlin, like this bullpen is really, I think it's gone through a facelift, and that facelift is a positive. And the only thing that doesn't make my grade up into an A+ is I would have liked to see another reliever or two, like David Robertson. If the Blue Jays went out and got David Robertson right now to just shore up that bullpen, I'd put it to an A, right? Just because you'd have another guy to kind of depend on. And right now, the Blue Jays have like a couple bullpen spots open that you're like, like I'd rather have David Robertson versus, like Tommy Nance or something. Like, there's a couple of hemming and hawing that way, especially since Swanson's hurt. But that rotation's in a lot better shape than what we saw last season. The bullpen's in a different shape, but is, at least on paper, good to go to start the year. And hopefully things stay on track, that you get that 2023 form and not the 2024.
Yeah. Again, I think we're in lockstep. I gave it a B as well. I think that when you have the 4 starters that you have going into the year, and you can kind of play around with that fifth spot a little bit, That's going to be the start that tends to get skipped, in the early part of the season when there's those extra days off early on. I think that it's going to be something that's interesting to see how it kind of shakes out. The bullpen is a bit more of a question mark for me. I live in the South Jersey area, so I saw a lot of Hoffman and a lot of, ups and downs for Philly fans looking at when he came into the game. But I think that, he is starting to find that a little bit more. So the Sandlin move, as we've talked about, is something that I think is going to play out really underratedly for this team. But, as it stands right now, I think that there are some things to be a little bit curious about as to how it plays out for the season. But overall, I think it's positive and above average grade. So now, as we get into the divisional ranking predictions, right? Pacoda has the Blue Jays coming in third with 85 wins, and Fangraphs had the Blue Jays coming in fifth with 82 wins. Where do you see the Blue Jays landing in the divisional race? I know you said second earlier. What does that win total look like?
I kind of side, like my bold prediction is they finish second. In reality, I think they finish third with about the 84 to 87 win ratio. The problem is the AL East is just such a demon, right? Like the Yankees losing Cole and having some starting rotation question marks, right? Like and get like you don't know, like losing a few games to start the season has just such a huge impact when it comes to that AL East, right? And all these AL East teams play each other. It's the same in every division, obviously, but you play the division so much to start the year and then so much at the end of the season. And sometimes it matters and sometimes it doesn't. Right? For the Blue Jays last season, it didn't matter at the end of the season, right? You were just playing spoiler. But this Blue Jays team, I think what's interesting about them is they're playing with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, right? Like they know that people don't consider them to be a top guy, right? Like, and they know that people make fun of them of the off season and what they've done. And Jeff Hoffman had a deal in line with the Orioles and it fell through, right? Like he's playing with a chip on his shoulder every time he faces like he wants the ball because he just wants to tell him to shut up every time, right? Like, and I think that's huge, right? From a mentality standpoint, whatnot. But if I have to go with a reality prediction, I think third place is definitely within grasp. I think 84 to 87 wins is a really good range. Again, the problem being is you could get 85 wins and still be fifth in the AL East because that's just how the AL East is, right? Like, so that's where the ranking of third kind of gets a little sketchy. But I think 84 to 87 wins is definitely within range. I think anything more than that is just subject to a team within the AL East just having just an awful time, like the Rays or the Yankees. It's someone just struggling, right? Like with the Lucas Giolito injury, like the Red Sox just don't find a way and they start to like something happens and they're just at the very bottom for a long time, right? Like, but I think third place with AL wildcard contentions between 84 to 87 wins is definitely within grasp. Anything more than that is a win.
Yeah, definitely. And as you said, this is a division that typically goes down to the wire for the divisional title. And it's usually between two or three teams at least. So I think that there's a lot when it comes to this division, especially when you stack it and you look this year in particular against some of the other ones, right? So when you look at the American League Central, everybody's going to beat up on the White Sox, right? So it's not a fair comparison. And even the AL West, to me, the entire division right now is kind of taking a little bit of a step back. Obviously, we've seen the Astros lose some people, and that's going to be a big hit to them. So it's going to be interesting to see how everything shakes out. The knock last year for the Yankees when they made it to the World Series was they had an easy run because the American League was down across the board. So it's going to be interesting to see how the AL East bounces back, and I think that determines the strength of the American League.
100%.
Now, as we kind of bring it to the close using the title of this series, what do you see as the state of the franchise for the Toronto Blue Jays?
Volatile, really. It's again, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. This team doesn't have a core on the roster books past 2026, right? Like they don't have Bichette, Guerrero, these guys, like they don't have them signed to long-term deals. Kevin Gosman's a free agent soon. Chris Bassett's a free agent at the end of the year. Dalton Varshaw's a free agent after 2026. Kirk's a free agent after 2026. Like a huge amount of these players are free agent eligible. And the Blue Jays farm system isn't in the top tier by any means, even after all the assets that they acquired at the trade deadline last year. Like there's some really good players, there's some serviceable players, but you're not talking like the Red Sox, right? Like Roman Anthony and Christian Campbell or whatever. Like those guys are like way up here, and the Blue Jays don't have that, right? Like Arjun Amal is great. Ricky Tiedemann got hurt, and Jake Bloss is up and down. Brandon Barea, who was supposed to be the guy that go up there, like he got hurt. Alec Manoah, like there's just so many question marks. There's so much volatility, and the fact that you throw in Guerrero Jr. not being extended to a long-term deal, like there's just a lot of volatility, right? And the front office could easily be axed this year if the Blue Jays don't do well. Their contracts are coming up too when it comes to Mark Shapiro and Atkins, right? Like they're within the next 2 years, both technically free agent eligible, and the state of this franchise is just not clear. It's not clear what the future holds. So that's why this season is so important to be like, they got to win, right? Like this is the season to win, because next season is not guaranteed to be anything similar to what this team looks like right now. And that's a scary thought for an organization that competes in the AL East.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that, and I've said it a couple of times already, but this is going to be an interesting season for baseball as a whole. I think that, and we've mentioned it throughout the course of this series on different broadcasts, but there's an impending CBA lockout that's coming. Like we just have to be real about what's approaching, for us as baseball fans. And I think that when you look at an organization like the Blue Jays, as you mentioned, there's no certainty for this team, beyond this year, but beyond the next 2 years, there's no certainty at all. And as baseball fans kind of looking at that, you have to wonder for your own team, where's the direction going, and whether or not that impending CBA potential lockout, and more than likely lockout, is affecting those decisions, right? Because we don't know what the financials will look like at that point. So is that something that's playing into the Blue Jays kind of holding back their offer towards Guerrero? Is it going to be something that when the new CBA comes out, is there going to be a penalty now in the way that we've seen the Dodgers do things and we've seen the Mets do things, the Yankees and the way they've done things in the past? Is there going to be more penalties in that? And that's what the Blue Jays are afraid of having to deal with. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how everything kind of shakes out, not just for the Blue Jays, but for baseball as a whole heading into this season. So definitely an interesting and entertaining campaign, I think, is headed our way for the 2025 season. But Tyson, I want to thank you for joining me, man. This has been a fun conversation, talking Blue Jays and AL East ball. Let everybody know where they can get more content from you, more Blue Jays talk.
Yeah, so we have a really talented team at the Jays Nation. You can find us on X and Instagram at the Jays Nation under the Nation Network. And then myself personally on X at Tyson_MLB. I talk a lot of Blue Jays and Canadian baseball too, so I cover a lot of Canadian baseball topics for the Canadian Baseball Network and a few other sites there. So if you want to be bored to death by Blue Jays in Canada, which is a testy topic depending on who you talk to, but I just talk baseball at the end of the day. So
for sure, man. No, we appreciate it, and we definitely. We've had a fun time going through this series, and we're coming down to the end. So this was one of the more fun ones to be able to make sure we got some representation, because you guys were the last ones to actually sign on to be a part of this series with us. So
nice.
Yeah, so it was very interesting to kind of get that final yes to be able to make this series happen and have
Perfect.
a complete 30 team set. So we definitely appreciate you jumping on with us. So once again, this has been the State of the Franchise. If you're checking us out on the YouTube side, Make sure you hit that like button as well as the subscribe and the bell for post notifications. So each and every time we drop new content like the state of the franchise, you will be notified, as well as making sure that you check out our link tree in the description below, as it has all the pertinent details to our merch store, our sponsor links, including our new affiliate partnership with Top Sports Trading Card Company. Make sure you check out our social platforms. We're all over every single one of them. And if you're listening on the audio side of things, make sure you leave a 5-star rating and review. I want to thank you guys for joining us once again here on the State of the Franchise on the Baseball Banter broadcast. We'll catch you on the next one. Peace.